Months had passed since Richard buried Helen. Months, yet the house hadn't learned how to forget her. It still held her scent, a faint whisper of roses from the garden and old paper woven into the quiet afternoon air. Richard sat in the worn armchair in the living room, his calloused hands resting loosely on the frayed upholstery. This was Helen's chair. He could feel the familiar dip in the cushion where she had sat for thousands of evenings, legs curled under her, a book open in her lap. Sometimes, if he sat perfectly still and closed his eyes, he could almost hear the soft rustle of her turning a page, or the quiet click of her tongue when she reached a captivating passage. But when he opened his eyes, only silence answered. It was a heavy silence, different from the peaceful quiet he and Helen had once shared. It filled every corner, seeped through every crack, turning the home they had built over 40 years into a museum of memory. Her reading glasses still lay on a stack of gardening magazines, waiting for hands that would never pick them up again. The wool shawl she'd been knitting was still in its basket, needles stuck through an unfinished row of moss-green yarn. Everything was in its place, frozen in time, silent witnesses to a life abruptly stopped. The shrill ring of the telephone tore through the stillness. Richard flinched, his hand flying to his chest as if the sound were a physical blow. He glanced at the screen, the name Laura glowing there. He took a deep breath before answering. "Hi, honey," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Dad, how are you?" Laura's voice on the other end was quick and efficient, as if concern were an item to be checked off a to-do list. "Are you eating enough? Mark and I are worried about you." "I'm fine, just finished lunch," he lied. Lunch had been a piece of toast he'd forgotten to eat that morning. "Good," she said, and he could hear the clatter of a keyboard in the background. "Listen, Dad, Mark and I are going to stop by this weekend. We need to talk to you about a few things, important things, about the future." Richard frowned. "The future?" "Yes, it's just, we think it's time to make some practical decisions, to make sure you're taken care of." Something in her use of the word practical sent a chill down his spine. It was a word Mark used often, a word that sounded sensible, but was usually a mask for impatience. "I take good care of myself, Laura." I know, she said quickly. "But you know, this house, it's a lot to manage. We just want what's best for you." The call ended as quickly as it had begun. Richard put the phone down, a sense of unease creeping into his chest. He looked around the living room, his gaze landing on their wedding photo on the mantelpiece. In it, Helen was beaming, her eyes sparkling with joy. "They just want what's best for me, don't they, honey?" he whispered to the picture. But when he looked at his own reflection in the glass, all he saw was a lonely man, standing among his memories, with a vague feeling that those memories were under threat. Sunday arrived with a heaviness hanging in the air. Richard had spent the morning on meaningless tasks, rewiping the already spotless china plates, rearranging the books on the shelves even though they were in the precise order Helen had loved. He was trying to cling to order, as if it could shield him from the chaos he felt was coming. At 2 o'clock sharp, Mark's silver SUV rolled up the gravel driveway. Richard watched from the window. Mark got out first, his smart casual attire looking out of place in the garden. He carried no flowers, no gift, just a slim leather briefcase tucked under his arm. Laura followed, her smile as carefully applied as if she were walking into a business meeting, not visiting her father. They didn't sit in the living room with Helen's armchair. Instead, Mark led the way to the dining room, where the polished mahogany table was far too large for one person. He placed the briefcase on the table with a soft but definitive thud. "Dad," Mark began without preamble, "thanks for making time. I know this isn't easy, but we need to be realistic." Laura placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be comforting but felt cold. "We're just worried about you, being alone in this big house." Mark opened the briefcase, pulling out a neatly organized file. "I've spoken to a few experts," he continued, flipping through pages printed with charts and figures. "The real estate market is at its peak. "This is the prime time to sell, Dad. We can maximize the asset's value." He pushed a glossy brochure across the table toward Richard. On it was a picture of a modern apartment building, identical matchbox units with glass balconies. "The Summit Residences. I found the perfect place for you. 24/7 security, a pool, a gym, no more worrying about mowing the lawn or fixing the roof." Richard stared at the photos. Everything was clean, shiny, and soulless. It had no garden, no dip in an armchair, no scent of Helen. "But this house," Richard stammered. "Your mother, the memories." "Dad, memories don't pay property taxes," Mark cut in, his impatience beginning to show, "and we have to think about maintenance costs. They're only going to go up." Laura chimed in, her voice artificially sweet. "Mom would want you to be safe and comfortable, not burdened by all this. Besides," she paused, glancing at her brother, "we've already found a very motivated buyer. They're offering top dollar and not asking for much." Richard felt his chest tighten. We've already found a buyer. They hadn't just planned, they had acted behind his back. This wasn't a discussion, it was an announcement. "You didn't ask me," he said, his voice hoarse. "We're doing this for you," Mark said, raising his voice as if the fact were being questioned. "You're being too emotional. This is the smartest financial move." They left the file on the dining table, next to the brochure for the Summit Residences. The light from the chandelier reflected off the glossy, cold paper. "Just think about it," Laura said as they stood to leave. "We'll be back next weekend. Hopefully, you'll be ready to sign the papers then." The door closed, returning the house to its silence. But this time, it wasn't the silence of memory. It was the silence of a siege. Richard sat alone at the dining table, staring at the papers that dictated the fate of his home. He felt like a ghost in his own house, a relic of the past that his practical children were trying to tidy away. For the rest of the week, Richard walked around in a daze. The file and the glossy brochure sat on the dining table like a constant reminder of his powerlessness. The house, once his sanctuary, now felt like a waiting room for a verdict. Whenever Mark or Laura called, he gave a non-committal, "I'm still thinking," and each time he felt a small part of himself die. On Thursday evening, unable to bear the empty silence, he sought out the one place in the house that still felt entirely like Helen, her study. It was a small room, filled with the smell of old books and the lemon oil she used to polish the wood. He sat in her leather chair, breathing it in. It was here that he felt a need to do something, not to fight back, but to hold on. He decided to organize her old papers, a task he'd been putting off, as a way to be close to her for a little while longer. He opened each drawer, sifting through old receipts and faded birthday cards. When he got to the bottom drawer, the one that always stuck a little, his hand paused. There was a different feeling, a slight give he'd never noticed before. He bent down for a closer look and saw that a thin piece of wood at the bottom of the drawer didn't seem to fit perfectly. Curious, he pried at it with his fingertips. The wood popped free, revealing a small hidden compartment beneath. And there, neat and dust-free, was a small oak box. Richard's heart began to beat faster. He knew this box. Helen had bought it at an antique fair on their anniversary trip, saying she would use it for the things that truly matter. He had never asked what they were. He lifted the box out, feeling its weight in his hands. Taped to the lid was a yellow sticky note, aged but still flat. Helen's neat, decisive handwriting stood out. "If you're reading this, it means you need to know what's inside." With trembling hands, he opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of red velvet, was a sealed letter, a set of brass keys, and a thick, ribbon-tied file. He picked up the letter first. Helen's script filled the page, both familiar and powerful. "My dearest Richard, if you found this, it means I'm gone, and if I know our children, the calls have already started. Don't be surprised. I've seen this coming for years. I saw it in the way they look at our home. not as a home, but as an investment. I saw it in the way they calculated things that were never theirs to count. You always gave them the benefit of the doubt. I stopped doing that a long time ago. This house is yours. It will always be yours. But I know they won't leave you in peace. That's why I made a backup plan. In this box are the files for a small cottage in the lake town of Hendersonville. I got it with my own savings. It's in my name, but this letter, along with the will I've prepared with my lawyer, will prove it is yours. I've also opened a separate bank account with enough for you to live comfortably without explaining yourself to anyone. This is your breathing room, Richard, for when others try to take the air from you. Don't fight the way they expect you to. Don't turn into a bitter old man. Disappear for a while if you have to. Sometimes, the only way to win is to refuse to play their game. Love you, always, Helen. Richard read the letter again and again, tears blurring the words. He wasn't crying from grief, but from a profound, choking gratitude. Helen, his clever, thoughtful wife, hadn't left him alone. She had given him a path, an escape, a weapon. He opened the file. Sure enough, there was a deed for a house in Hendersonville, bank statements for an account he never knew existed, and the contact information for a law firm in Lisbon, Portugal, that managed a small villa in her name. He picked up the brass keys, feeling the cool metal in his palm. The despair was gone. In its place was a cold, solid resolve. He stood up and walked back to the dining room. Mark's file and Laura's brochure were still there, arrogant and calculated. But now they looked small and pathetic. Richard picked them up, not with anger, but with a distant pity. He walked straight to the kitchen trash can and dropped them in. The sound of the paper hitting the bottom was deeply satisfying. He wasn't going to sign. He wasn't going to move. And he wasn't going to let them know what he knew. The game had changed, and now he was the one holding the secret cards. Richard didn't call his children right away. He spent Friday following Helen's instructions. He called the law firm she had noted in the file, a small but reputable office downtown. The voice on the other end was professional and discreet. When Richard mentioned Helen's name, the formality seemed to warm slightly. He made an appointment for Monday morning. The feeling of taking action was unfamiliar, like putting on an old coat he hadn't worn in years that still fit surprisingly well. He was no longer a grieving father backed into a corner. He was a man carrying out his wife's final wishes. The weekend passed in a tense silence. Mark and Laura didn't call, probably assuming his silence meant compliance. They were wrong. On Monday morning, Richard put on his best suit, carefully knotted a tie, and drove to the lawyer's office. Peter, an older lawyer with silver hair and sharp eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses, was waiting. He had been Helen's friend since college, a man of principle and integrity. "Richard," Peter said, shaking his hand firmly, "I'm so sorry about Helen. She was a phenomenal woman." "Thank you, Peter. That's why I'm here, because of her." Richard placed the oak box on the desk. He didn't tell the whole story, just the necessary parts, the pressure from his kids, the apartment brochure, the demand to sign papers. Then he opened the box and showed Peter Helen's letter and the documents for the secret cottage. Peter read slowly, his thick eyebrows knitting together. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, looking at Richard over his glasses. Helen was always 2 steps ahead of everyone, he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. This time is no different. He laid out the legal situation clearly. The family home is entirely yours, Richard. No one can force you to sell it. As for the Hendersonville house and the bank account, Helen set them up brilliantly. They are outside of the standard will and transferred directly to you, completely separate from any joint assets. Legally, your children have no claim to them. So what should I do? Richard asked. For now, Peter said, steepling his fingers, we play for time. Let them think you're still wavering. I'll draft a formal letter to Mark and Laura informing them that as your legal counsel, I am conducting a full review of your assets and Helen's estate. This process will take time. That will give you the breathing room you need to decide your next move. Richard felt an immense weight lift from his shoulders. Thank you, Peter. Don't thank me, Peter said. Thank Helen. She's protecting you, even now. Leaving the lawyer's office, Richard felt like a different man. He drove home, but instead of unease, he felt a cold confidence settling in. As predicted, Mark called that evening. Dad, Laura and I were thinking of bringing the realtor over this weekend to have a look. Richard cut him off, his voice surprisingly calm and firm. That won't work, Mark. What do you mean it won't work? The buyers won't wait forever. I've spoken with your mother's lawyer, Peter. He says it will take time to review the full estate and her will. Until he's finished, I can't sign anything. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Richard could almost picture his son's face, confusion turning to anger. A lawyer? Why did you get a lawyer? Don't you trust us? It's not about trust, Mark, Richard replied, repeating the exact words Peter had advised. It's a matter of procedure. It has to be done by the book. Is that old lawyer putting ideas in your head? Mark snarled. He's just trying to run up a bill. Watch your tone, Mark, Richard said, his own voice turning to ice. I'll call you when I have an update from Peter. Goodbye. He hung up before Mark could say another word. For the first time in months, he had ended the conversation. He stood in the kitchen, looking out at the garden as it faded into twilight. The first battle was over, and he had won. He knew it was just a beginning, but at least he was no longer fighting alone. After the tense call with Mark, Richard knew he couldn't stay in the house, not right now. The air had become thick with his children's expectations and disappointment. He needed space, a place where he could hear his own thoughts instead of the echo of their words. He needed to go to Hendersonville. He left early the next morning, leaving only a short note on the kitchen table. Needed to get away for a few days to think. Don't worry. He didn't pack much, just a small duffel bag with a change of clothes and Helen's oak box. The 40-minute drive took him out of the familiar suburbs and onto quieter country roads. Hendersonville was a small, charming town where time seemed to slow down. Following the address on the deed, he turned down a short gravel lane, hidden by a line of tall pines. And then he saw it. A small white cottage with blue shutters and a sturdy-looking stone porch. It wasn't grand, but it had a quiet grace. It looked like it had been waiting for him. Richard walked up the stone steps, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He pulled the brass key from his pocket, feeling its cool weight. It slid into the lock smoothly, perfectly. When the door opened, a warm scent greeted him, cedar and something sweet and familiar. Inside, everything was neat and clean, as if Helen had just left. Morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating a cozy living room. There was a sofa in the exact style of the first one they ever bought, and a bookshelf filled with titles he knew Helen loved, arranged in her specific order. On the wooden mantelpiece were framed photos, him and Helen on their 35th anniversary, a picture of her laughing on a beach, and then one he'd never seen, Helen, sitting on this very porch, a coffee cup in her hand, smiling at the photographer he presumed was the seller. On the coffee table, next to a set of coasters, was a folded note. Richard picked it up. "Here's to you, in case they forget who you are." Helen's words, no explanation needed, went straight to his heart. She hadn't just foreseen their greed. She had seen his vulnerability, his fear of being erased from his own story. He walked into the kitchen. Everything was ready. The cupboards held neat stacks of plates, and the pantry was stocked with dry goods like pasta and rice. On the inside of a cabinet door, a shopping list in Helen's handwriting was still there. Coffee, bread, eggs, sugar. 2 chairs were tucked neatly under a small table, one with a cushion he recognized as her handiwork. In the bedroom, the bed was perfectly made, a quilt folded at its foot. The other room was sparer, with just a few boxes stacked in the corner labeled George's things. Richard went back to the living room, sat in the armchair by the window, and looked out at the garden. A deep peace, one he hadn't felt in months, settled over him. This wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary. It was tangible proof of Helen's love and foresight. She hadn't left him a battle, she had left him a fortress. From here, from this safe place, he could face anything. The anger and helplessness dissolved, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. He would not lose their home, and he would not let his children dictate his life. He would fight, not with bitterness, but with the wisdom and strength Helen had so quietly given him. Richard spent the next 2 weeks living between 2 worlds. By day, he drove to Hendersonville, where he found peace in fixing small things around the cottage, repainting a section of fence, replacing a creaky floorboard. The manual labor felt grounding, purposeful. In the evenings, he returned to the family home, which now felt like a silent outpost, awaiting the enemy's next move. And they didn't make him wait long. Mark's patience had run out. "Dad, it's been 2 weeks," he said over the phone, his tone stripped of all pretense. "How long is this review of Peter's going to take? Are you sure you understand everything he's telling you? Maybe I should just talk to him directly." It was a thinly veiled question, but Richard heard the subtext clearly. "You're too old to understand this complicated stuff. Let me handle it." "That won't be necessary, Mark," Richard replied, his voice calm. "I understand perfectly. When there's news, I'll let you know." Laura took a different route, one more subtle and insidious. A few days later, Richard got a call from his Aunt Carol, Helen's sister. "Richard," she began, her voice laced with concern, "I was just talking to Laura. She said you've seemed tired and forgetful lately. I'm so worried. Being all alone in that big house can't be good for you. Mark and Laura just want what's best for you, you know?" Richard felt a cold anger rise in him. Laura wasn't just applying pressure, she was building a narrative behind his back, painting a picture of a frail, confused old man who needed to be protected. "I'm fine, Carol. Thanks for your concern," he said, keeping his voice polite. But not everyone was buying it. One afternoon, Mrs. Carter from across the street brought over a plate of still warm cookies. She was an elderly woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing in the neighborhood. "Richard," she said, setting the plate on his table, "don't you let those kids bully you. This is your house. Helen would want you to stay right here." Her directness was a breath of fresh air. He wasn't entirely alone, at least. After every call, whether from his children or relatives, Richard carefully documented it in a notebook: the date, time, who called, and what they said. This was Peter's advice. "Log everything, Richard. We need a record of their behavior." The notebook grew thicker with evidence of coercion and manipulation. Richard realized his children didn't just want the house, they wanted control. They wanted to write the final chapter of his life for him, a chapter in which he was a minor character, faded and compliant. One evening, sitting on the porch in Hendersonville, watching the stars glitter on the calm lake, Richard thought of Helen. He remembered her words from the letter: "Don't fight the way they expect you to." He wouldn't get angry, he wouldn't argue, he would quietly build his defenses, brick by brick, with patience and irrefutable proof. They thought they were cornering a weak old man, but they were walking step by step into a trap of their own making. The escalation came on a Tuesday afternoon, not as a phone call, but as a man in a cheap suit standing on Richard's doorstep. He didn't give a name, just handed over a thick manila envelope. "For Richard Hale," he said, his voice flat and detached. Richard took the envelope, feeling its weight. As the man turned away, he closed the door and leaned against it, his heart giving one hard thud before slowing to a worrisome crawl. He knew this wasn't good news. He sat at the kitchen table, where the afternoon sun slanted across the surface, and opened the envelope. The first words, in bold and formal type, leaped out at him: Petition for conservatorship. Beneath it were the names of the petitioners, Mark Hale and Laura Hale. Richard read on, each word a small, cold stab. The petition alleged that he, Richard Hale, due to cognitive decline and erratic financial behavior, was no longer competent to manage his own affairs and personal decisions. They cited his irrational refusal to sell a valuable asset, the house, his increasing social isolation, and his hostility toward reasonable family advice. They asked the court to appoint them as co-conservators, giving them full control over his finances and medical decisions. A surge of rage rose in Richard's chest, so hot it nearly burned away the hurt. This was no longer about a house. This was an attack on his personhood, his autonomy, his dignity. They didn't just want his assets. They wanted to seize his life, to turn him into a child in an old man's body, a name on a piece of paper they could control. For a moment, he felt dizzy. But then, an image of Helen in the garden, her hands covered in dirt, a radiant smile on her face, flashed in his mind. Don't fight the way they expect you to. His rage cooled, hardening into something more solid: resolve. He picked up the phone and called Peter. He read every word of the petition aloud, his voice steady. They actually did it, Peter. There was a short silence on the other end. Then the lawyer's long sigh. I was afraid of this, Richard, but they've made a fatal mistake. A mistake? They've declared war on paper, Peter said, his voice now sharp, and that's our battlefield. They've given us a stage, and we're going to use it to put their greed on trial. What do I do? Nothing. Don't call them, don't answer their texts. From this point on, all communication goes through me. As for you, Peter paused, get ready. This isn't defense anymore, Richard. This is a counteroffensive. When Richard hung up, he felt a profound shift. The fear was gone. The hesitation had vanished. Mark and Laura had gone too far, crossed every line of decency. They had chosen the battlefield, and he would meet them there. He walked into Helen's study, opened the oak box, and placed it on the desk. He looked at the letter, the file, the keys. This wasn't just a sanctuary anymore. This was his arsenal, and he was ready to use it. Peter's office smelled of old paper and strong coffee, the scent of battles won and lost on the page. Richard sat across from the lawyer, his notebook of logs placed neatly on the desk. They've given us a gift, Richard, Peter said, pushing his glasses up. A court hearing. It's a public stage where the truth has a way of shining brighter than it does in the shadows. What's the plan? Richard asked, all hesitation gone from his voice. Their plan is to paint a picture of a confused, isolated old man who can't make his own decisions. Our plan, Peter smiled grimly, is to overwhelmingly prove the opposite, and in doing so, expose their true motive: greed. They spent the morning mapping out their strategy. First, his health. Peter had already scheduled a full evaluation with a top geriatric specialist who had no connection to their family. We need an objective, unimpeachable assessment, Peter insisted. Next, the witnesses. Richard immediately thought of Mrs. Carter. That afternoon, he returned her cookie plate, now holding a freshly baked loaf of banana bread. Mrs. Carter, he began, I need to ask you for a favor. As he explained the conservatorship hearing, Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed. Ungrateful children, she muttered. Of course, Richard. I'll tell the judge what I see every day. A man who tends his own garden, drives himself to the market, and is sharp enough to know when a good turn deserves banana bread. Finally, and most decisively, there was the matter of finances. They claim you're managing your finances erratically, Peter said at their next meeting. Let's show them what real financial management looks like. Following Peter's advice, Richard went to the bank the next day. He didn't see a teller. He met with the branch manager, a woman named Laurel he'd known for years. "Laurel, I need your help," Richard said. "I want to place a temporary freeze on access to all sub-accounts linked to my children's cards. Any transaction from now on will require my direct, in-person signature." Laurel looked at him with understanding. "Done, Richard. Effective immediately." The fallout was faster than Richard had anticipated. Just 2 days later, Laura called, her voice shrill with anger. "Dad, what is going on? My card was declined at the grocery store. It was so embarrassing." "Oh," Richard replied, his voice calm. "You should probably take that up with my lawyer, Peter. All financial matters are going through him for the time being. It's procedure, darling." He could almost hear her teeth grinding before she slammed the phone down. Mark's call came moments later, full of bluster, but Richard gave him the same answer. The financial door they had taken for granted had been slammed shut. The angry voicemails they left were carefully saved by Richard, becoming another part of his growing arsenal of evidence. Richard felt a distinct change in himself. He was no longer hiding. He was confronting. Every move he made was calculated, every action a chess piece. He was no longer a victim in his children's story. He was writing his own, a story of reclaimed dignity, and he knew the ending would be nothing like Mark and Laura had imagined. The morning of the hearing, Richard woke before the dawn had the courage to paint the sky. The house was unusually quiet, as if it too were holding its breath. He didn't feel nervous, but rather a cold stillness. The storm was here, and he was ready to stand in the middle of it. He didn't rush. He made coffee, the familiar aroma filling the kitchen. He stood by the window, looking out at Helen's garden. Morning dew clung to the last of the autumn roses, glittering like tears. He didn't talk to Helen's pictures anymore. This morning, he felt her presence in the quiet of the house, in the strength of its walls, and in the steel of his own resolve. After he showered, he opened his closet, bypassing his usual shirts to pull out an old navy blue suit. Helen had bought it for him for Mark's college graduation. "You need something proper for important occasions," she had said, smoothing the lapel. He had worn it to anniversaries, job interviews, and finally, to her funeral. Today, it would serve for another important occasion. Putting on the suit felt like putting on armor. He looked in the mirror, not at a grieving, tired old man, but at Richard Hale, the man who had built this life, who had loved Helen with all his heart, and who would not let his legacy be dismantled by greed. He double-checked the leather briefcase Peter had prepared. Everything was there. The medical evaluation, the financial reports, Mrs. Carter's written testimony, the recordings of the angry voicemails. And at the bottom, in its own folder, was a copy of Helen's letter and the deed to the Hendersonville house. The secret weapon, the final ace. Before he left, he stopped in the living room, his hand resting on Helen's armchair. The worn fabric was soft beneath his fingers. "You'd be proud of me, Helen," he whispered. "I'm not going to let them make our house an empty one." He closed the front door behind him, the dry click of the lock sounding like a declaration. His steps were firm on the gravel path. He wasn't going to court to win a battle. He was going to end a war. The courtroom was cold and formal, filled with the smell of old oak and heavy silence. Richard sat next to Peter, his back straight, his hands resting on the leather briefcase. He didn't look over to the other side, where Mark and Laura sat with their lawyer. He could feel their confidence, a blind confidence built on the belief that he was old and alone. Mark and Laura's lawyer went first. He spoke smoothly, painting a picture of a pitiable father, lost in grief, making unstable decisions, and in need of the protection of his loving children. He highlighted Richard's refusal to sell the house as proof of his disconnection from reality. When it was Peter's turn, he didn't rush. He rose slowly, his calm demeanor seeming to fill the room. "Your Honor," Peter began, his voice clear and firm, "we are not here today to debate my client's competence. We are here to debate the motives of the petitioners. Peter began his methodical counterattack. First, he presented the comprehensive medical evaluation, which concluded Richard was of sound mind and full capacity. Next, he produced the financial reports, showing a history of prudent management with no signs of erratic behavior. He called Mrs. Carter to the stand, who gave a vivid account of Richard's independent and active daily life. The atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift. The confident looks on Mark's and Laura's faces faded, replaced by confusion. But Peter wasn't done. The petitioners claim my client is isolated and hostile to reasonable advice, Peter said, and then he played a recording. Is that old lawyer putting ideas in your head? He's just trying to run up a bill. Peter stopped the tape. Is that the tone of a son offering reasonable advice? Or is it the tone of coercion? Mark's face flushed crimson. Laura stared at the floor. And then Peter delivered the final blow. The petitioners say my client's refusal to sell the house is irrational. But what if that action was perfectly rational, part of a pre-existing plan put in place by someone even wiser than all of us? Peter pulled an envelope from Richard's briefcase. Your Honor, I would like to read an excerpt from a letter left for my client by his late wife, Helen Hale. He read Helen's words aloud, her voice seeming to echo in the room, speaking of her love, her foresight into her children's greed, and the plan she had made. When Peter read the line, "This is your breathing room, Richard, for when others try to take the air from you," he saw a juror dab at their eye. Mark and Laura were frozen, their faces white as if they'd seen a ghost. And to execute that plan, Peter continued, his voice ringing out, Mrs. Hale left her husband the means. I submit into evidence the deed for a property in Hendersonville and the statements for a bank account of which the petitioners were completely unaware. He laid the documents on the judge's bench. Finally, Your Honor, in response to his children's attempts to seize his assets, my client, with full clarity and decisiveness, established a new trust. The majority of the estate the petitioners were targeting has been legally moved into it, far beyond their reach. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. The game was over. Mark and Laura hadn't just lost, they had been exposed. The judge, an older woman with a stern gaze, looked directly at Mark and Laura. This petition, she said, her voice like ice, is not only baseless, it is a shameful act. The court dismisses it in its entirety. She paused, fixing them with a punishing stare. And I am warning you both, any further attempts to pressure or harass your father will be met with the most severe legal consequences. Her gavel came down with a sharp, final crack that put an end to it all. Richard looked at his children. He felt no triumph, only a deep, aching sadness. They'd had everything, a family, their parents' love, and they had traded it for greed. As their lawyer led them from the room, they couldn't meet his eyes. The battle was over. Richard had not just saved his house, he had reclaimed his life. Richard didn't go home right away. He drove straight to Hendersonville. As he turned the brass key in the lock and opened the door to the cottage, a true sense of peace washed over him. It wasn't a loud victory. It was a quiet liberation. He hadn't destroyed his family. He had simply refused to let it destroy him. He stayed for 3 days, with no phone and no news. He spent his time walking by the lake, fixing a squeaky porch swing, and finishing one of Helen's old mystery novels. For the first time in months, he slept deeply, without dreams. When he returned on the 4th day, something was different. The house was the same, but the yard had been tidied. The grass was mowed, the autumn leaves neatly raked. On his front step sat a pot of bright yellow chrysanthemums with no note. He knew who had put it there. 2 days later, they came. Mark and Laura stood on his doorstep, stripped of their arrogance and calculation. They looked tired and somehow smaller. "Dad," Mark began, his voice rough, "can we come in?" Richard said nothing, just stepped aside. They sat in the living room, on the same sofa where they had plotted to take everything from him. Laura started crying first, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. "We're sorry, Dad," she whispered. "There are no words." Mark took a deep breath. "We were wrong. There's no excuse. We let greed get the better of us, and we treated you horribly. We forgot who you are." Richard listened, his heart heavy but no longer broken. "I don't need your apologies," he said, his voice low and clear. "I need you to understand." He looked at each of them. "I am not selling this house. I am not leaving. And from now on, our relationship will be built on respect, not demands. I am not an ATM or a problem to be managed. I am your father." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I am not cutting you out of my life, but you will have to earn your way back in, with sincerity, not empty words. The legacy your mother and I built isn't about numbers in a bank account. It's about how we treat each other." He stood up. "Now, if you have nothing else to say, I have some roses to prune." It was a gentle but firm dismissal. They understood. As they left, Richard saw not anger in their faces, but a kind of bitter acceptance. The road ahead would be long, but at least they had started down the same path, one illuminated by truth. Richard went back to his garden. As he picked up his pruning shears, he felt the house at his back no longer empty. It was filled again, not with the ghosts of the past, but with the fragile hope of a future. Spring came to Helen's garden first. Yellow daffodil shoots pushed through the damp earth, and the rose bushes began to bud with sweet promise. 6 months had passed since the hearing, 6 months of quiet and tentative steps. One Saturday morning, as Richard was in the garden, gloved and carefully trimming back the dead wood on the roses, he heard the crunch of gravel on the path. He looked up to see Mark approaching. His son wasn't in a suit, but an old t-shirt and jeans, carrying a toolbox. "The fence in the back corner looks a little wobbly," Mark said, by way of a greeting. "Thought I'd fix it." Richard said nothing, just nodded and pointed toward the shed. They worked together all morning, side by side in a comfortable silence. It wasn't the tense silence of the months before, but one filled with the sounds of a hammer, a saw, and birdsong. They didn't talk about the hearing or about money. They talked about the weather, about the baseball team, and about the best way to set a fence post. For the first time in years, they talked like two men doing a job together, not like two sides in a war. When they were finished, Mark stepped back to admire their work. "Looks good," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "It does," Richard replied. "Thank you." Mark hesitated for a moment. "Next weekend," he said, his eyes still on the fence, "Laura and I are making Mom's pot roast. We were wondering if you'd want to come for dinner." Richard looked at his son, at this man who now seemed tired, but also more genuine. "I'll be there," he said, and a warm, unforced smile touched his lips. Later that afternoon, Laura called. "Dad," she said, her voice free of its calculated edge, replaced by a slight embarrassment, "I'm trying to make Mom's lemon meringue pie, but I can never get the crust as flaky as hers. Do you remember her secret?" Richard smiled. He did remember. He remembered Helen patiently showing a clumsy teenage Laura years ago. "She always added a small spoonful of white vinegar to the dough," he said, "and don't overwork it." "Vinegar?" Laura exclaimed. "Really? I'll try it. Thanks, Dad." After the call, Richard went back to the garden. He knelt beside Helen's favorite rose bush, the one with creamy blossoms edged in pink. He carefully snipped away a spent bloom, making way for the new buds. He realized then that the true inheritance Helen had left wasn't the cottage in Hendersonville or the secret bank account. Her legacy was love, a love strong enough to see trouble coming, wise enough to give him the tools to defend himself, and forgiving enough to leave a path back for their lost children. The house was no longer empty. It was filled with the promise of blooming roses, a pot roast dinner, and the scent of a lemon meringue pie about to be baked just right. And Richard, the lonely gardener, had finally found peace, not in his memories, but in the present he had fought so bravely to reclaim.